Okay, let's look at the fullness of choice pattern now. This is pattern number 37. And I'm going to read the heart, and let's see where we go with this. Fullness of choice. Choice shapes action. Generative choice making includes creating and influencing our options, the self-knowing of how and why we choose, having and developing the capacity and means for effective choice, delving into conversations, understandings, and meanings that enable wise choices, and more. So support the fullness of informed choice, creative, generative, meaningful, conscious choice. So this is a really interesting one. We live in a culture that has a kind of reductive version of choice. On the one hand, there's binary choices, Coke or Pepsi, Democrat or Republican, pro-life, pro-choice, and we're habituated to picking the best of two, particularly in our politics. On the other hand, there's like an overwhelming variety of choices, many of which have insignificant differences or no way to really find out what's going on with each of those choices so that you could make an informed decision. I remember there was at the point of the fall of communism in Eastern Europe, there was a visitor here, an environmental minister from Bulgaria, and he was staying over with some friends of mine in Berkeley, and they took him to I think it was an Albertsons, a large grocery store, and he faced all these choices in the grocery store and didn't know what to do with them. He was not used to that abundance of choices. And we can look at that and go, oh, look, our Western society is so full of abundance. And then you start looking closely at what those choices are. And our capitalist market system has generated, wherever you can find a niche, put a product into that niche that's yours and then promote the hell out of it. And it's like, that has generated a whole pile of basically useless differences between things. And then we have, the Amazon, et cetera, with just endless choices. And it turns out that a lot of those reviews that we depend on are manipulated. It's just like, this is overwhelming and reaches a point of almost borderline uselessness. So these are two sides of a spectrum of dysfunctional choice. And usually when we're given an A or B choice, we don't have a lot to say about what's in A and what's in B. We don't, it's like very seldom we're given a choice of Coke or milk, or juice and Pepsi, or to say the milk, juice, Pepsi, Coke, whatever. Or in a health food store, we don't get the choice of the Pepsi. So the sense of what would make the act of choice most meaningful, and particularly having our ability to generate choices out of our experience, out of our values, in conversation, engagement with other people, what would be a meaningful set of choices if we can generate, the 6 most popular choices and then talk about them and come up with a decision about them. That's a very different thing than individually facing dozens or just 2 choices. There's a prioritization exercise I like called 35, where people create their idea for the best. That's a solution to a shared problem, a community problem, and each person writes down on a card the thing they think is the best thing that should be done about this. And then they go through a series of milling around and trading off cards to each other and doing little mini, 1-minute deliberations. You have to give 7 points, distribute 7 points to these 2 choices. uh, and 2 and 5 or 3 and 4, whatever, and write it on the back of the card, and then mill around, and then do that again. And you do that 5 times. That's why it's called 35, 5 times 7. And then you have people stop, look at the back of their cards, and see who has a 35, who has a 34. And you could generate from that. Here's the 10 most popular choices. Now let's get together and talk about those choices and see what we want to do with them. Either pick one of them or come up with something that's different, that was inspired by our conversation about that. So that's one example of co-generating choices. The dynamic facilitation, which is one of my favorite processes, has the kind of conversation that happens during dynamic facilitation. Jim Ruff, the founder of dynamic facilitation, calls choice creating, because the people are creating and they're looking at choices just in the process of saying what they're thinking and feeling all the time. It's a very interesting approach. So we want to have choices that we participate in creating. We want to have a full range with information about them. And if the range is going to be too big, have it curated, have it combined in various ways. And there's websites that do this kind of thing, and various pundits and thought leaders who take all these, this pattern language itself is a curated bunch of things. What do you want to focus on? Well, you pick one of these things to focus on, and within them, there's a bunch of resources and a bunch of information about them. So the sense of being able to delve deeper and have somebody doing the work, like Wikipedia, the somebodies are all volunteers. You can have professionals who are professional curators of information, selecting up, gathering, evaluating, and presenting in usable form to you. And one of the things that's interesting about decision making, which choice is intimately related to, is research that has shown you can't make a fully rational choice. You can't make a fully rational decision because you have to want something in order to make a decision. Reason and facts and research and all that can tell you more about what the consequences would be, what the advantages, disadvantages would be of this or that choice, but you can't choose until you want something. And that's a feeling, a desire. That's not rational. You can justify it in various rational ways, but people can want different things just because they want them. So values and desires and dreams are intrinsically part of choosing. So we want to have a process of choice that honors that dimension of it. The expertise on tap, not on top, which is another pattern here, embodies that in a very central way. We want information to help us figure out how to actually get what we want, because sometimes you can be given choices that look like they might get you what you want, but don't actually do that. The information you're given is manipulated, designed to get you to choose something for somebody else's benefit, not for yours. So having good information, having all the different forms of intelligence at play, the multimodal intelligence card comes into play here. There's a story I read in a book called Creating Community Anywhere about the Turtle Island Fund. This is a foundation, an alternative foundation. And they invite all these applications and they study all the applications, do research on the different things that people are wanting to do, get all the rational, detailed, factual information absorbed from all of these things. And then they do a meditation and they sit together, and the people who are the project program directors of this foundation, they sit together and meditate on what they've learned and sort of open up. See, is there any images, words, voices, what comes up when you just sit with what you've learned? And that decides whether they're going to be accepted or rejected. And then they write to the people who applied and say, this is what we found, this is what happened when we thought about it and sensed into it. And apparently the people who are rejected get as much benefit as the people who are accepted. But that's an example of multimodal intelligence being applied to something that's very specific and grounded. Here's a proposal to do something. And also, if we're doing the fullness of choice includes, it says delving into conversations, understandings, and meanings that enable wise choices. We're not just facilitating individual choice to do whatever people want. We are trying to help have choices that serve the prime directive. We want to take into account what needs to be taken into account for long-term broad benefit. We want to evoke and engage the wisdom and resourcefulness of the whole on behalf of the whole. And the choice point, between the first part of those things, like we want to engage the wisdom and resourcefulness of the whole, in order to be able to have the whole make a good decision on its behalf and implement that decision. So choice is like this leverage point. It's which path are you going to go on? And how do you do that? What supports are needed to enable a choice that will produce long-term broad benefit on behalf of the whole? And so there's an informational dimension to that. There's a freedom dimension to that. There's a co-creative dimension to that. And understanding individually and collectively why we would make a particular choice. So we are not making the wrong choices for the wrong reasons. We are aware that we're making this choice because of this, and there may be underlying things that we delve into. The more self-aware we are, and that's both an individual and collective phenomenon. You can see in a group, for example, that this choice may be made because one particular person has a particularly strong, articulate voice, or is inspirational or whatever, and pulls the group along with them. And that's not necessarily bad, but if the group is not aware of that and able to consider it and take, and use it correctly instead of just following it or resisting it, to understand, is this really serving us, and to know what's going on, that's part of choice too. And that's an example of collective self-awareness. And to be able to consider who's being impacted, where is the life energy, here's what I want. What do you want? What do we want? What will serve our whole community or the whole system or situation we're working on? What will serve the world, the future generations? To be able to hold all that, have digestible, useful information on that, and understand that if we're making a decision for somebody else to do something, that's very different from making a decision for us to do something, and the impact that that has. And behind all of this is a thing called choicelessness. And there's oppressed choicelessness, and there is enlightened choicelessness. There's a lot of the Zen material, Buddhist material, talks about reaching a point where you know individually, because you have become so self-aware and sensitive and open to your environment, it becomes clear what's the right thing to do. And or like in Aikido or some of the practices, the active practices and self-defense kinds of things, martial arts, there is a sense of the right time, the right action, improvisational stuff, jazz, whatever. There's just a sensing into being one with what's going on. And it's not a matter of thinking it out and making an informed choice. There's just a movement with. You're in tune. So that is more the enlightened choicelessness. And oppressive choicelessness, of course, says you're going to do this if you want to or not, or a sense that you're stuck. I can't switch jobs because I'll lose my insurance. It's like this feeling of choicelessness. So behind all of these factors is this sense of the ideal, individual and collective recognition, like the Native Americans say in their councils. In our councils, we talk until there's nothing left but the obvious truth. I mean, that's collective choicelessness of an enlightened kind, and we can strive for that. And individual choicelessness, of course, is your self-awareness and your attunement to your environment and what's going on. So that's the sense. This is not just informed choice. This is fullness. There's a wholeness about this, and you tap into the life energy in and around you when you have this kind of choice. And that life energy is informed life energy. It's doing this because it knows this is the way to go. So that's what this pattern is about.